On today's episode of Narcos Mexico, the dramatic case between the United States of America and Javier Vasquez-Velasco.
The key actors in this case are the United States prosecution, the Vasquez-Velasco defense, and the U.S. Court of Appeal in California.
Javier Vasquez-Velasco was a member of the Guadalajara cartel in Mexico. As a result of tightening pressure by the Drug Enforcement Agency in the 80s, the cartel began acts of retaliation in 1985 and 86. Among these acts of violence, two American civilians, John Walker and Alberto Radal, were murdered on January 30, 1985. Vasquez was tried for these murders alongside three co-defendants.
This case primarily explores the extraterritorial application of United States Code Section 1959, which criminalizes violent crimes in aid of a racketeering enterprise, including cartels. The extraterritorial validity of this statute depends on the legal mechanisms of congressional intent and international law. Because there is no constitutional prohibition on the extraterritorial application of U.S. penal laws, U.S. courts analyze congressional intent to determine extraterritorial application in a specific case. With regard to Section 1959 statute, the court has stated in United States v. Thomas that the location of the conduct is not relevant to the end sought by the enactment of the statute, and the statute prohibits conduct that obstructs the functioning of the United States government. Therefore, it is reasonable to infer congressional intent to reach crimes committed abroad.
Another legal mechanism that dictates a country's claim to extraterritorial jurisdiction is international law. This framework follows several core principles to determine matters of jurisdiction. The first principle, referred to as the objective territorial principle, states that jurisdiction to prosecute extraterritorial crimes is allocated to a country where foreign crimes are shown to have a detrimental impact within the prosecuting country. Additionally, the protective principle gives jurisdiction over foreigners to a country in the circumstance that a foreign act was committed that may threaten the territorial security or integrity of that country.
Following the previously mentioned legal frameworks of congressional intent and international law, the United States argued that their claim to extraterritorial jurisdiction of Vasquez-Velasco satisfied both conditions. Their argument posited that because drug trafficking inherently involves activity in foreign countries, thus often requiring DEA agents to work overseas, then the murder of a DEA agent abroad in retaliation for drug enforcement activities should be considered an act of violence in aid of racketeering activity against the United States. The U.S. government demonstrated a theory that Velasco and his accomplices mistakenly believed that the civilians Walker and Radalat were in fact DEA agents and killed them in retaliation for the damage the DEA had inflicted on the cartel. This meant that the violent crime was intentionally directed against the U.S. in order to further the cartel's initiatives by intimidating the DEA and other local police entities associated. Given this context, the murder of these American citizens was argued to have an equally detrimental impact on the United States security interests in combating the importation and trafficking of illegal narcotics.
In his appeal, the defendant Vasquez highlighted several arguments in order to help overturn his conviction. Vasquez's main argument was that his judicial privilege of extraterritoriality does not apply in this particular case. His claim was that even if extraterritoriality of Section 1959 can be extended to the murder of DEA agents, there was insufficient evidence to prove that the American tourists had been mistaken for law enforcement. This distinction is crucial, as jurisdiction would not be granted to the United States for the murder of American tourists, and as a result, Vasquez would not be subject to the U.S. penal system. The succeeding claims pertain to severance, misjoinder, and reduced sentence. In his misjoinder claim, Vasquez was arguing that his actions should not have been tried alongside his co-defendants, as their crimes were unrelated to one another. Furthermore, he argues the defense of severance, as the crimes committed by the others may incriminate him due to the gruesome and emotional nature of the evidence presented. An example is the audio recordings of DEA agent Camarena, the interrogation, in which Vasquez had no part of but was still tried by the same jury.
The proceedings of this case were heavily dependent on the outcome of United States v. Felix Gutierrez. Velasco's appeal centered around the second trial of this case pertaining to the 1985 kidnapping and murders of DEA agents Enrique Camarena and Alfredo Zavala. In this case, the U.S. presented their theory that Gutierrez had killed the DEA members for the purposes of retaliation and intimidation against the DEA, and asserted that Velasco had also killed the American citizens as part of that same cartel initiative. Velasco's team appealed this case by arguing for the improper joinder of the two cases, claiming there was insufficient evidence for any connection. The United States represented proof of the cartel conspiracy against the DEA in the Gutierrez case, which laid the foundation for their case against Velasco as being connected to this initiative. As a result, the conviction of Felix Gutierrez was a pivotal juncture in influencing the outcome of the Velasco case.
At the end of the appeal process, the court's decision was to dismiss Velasco's appeals and side with the prosecution. In its conclusion, Judge Fletcher stated that in this case, Section 1959 could in fact apply extraterritorially, given the U.S. jurisdiction over the crimes committed by Vasquez in Mexico. The reasoning provided was that the judges concurred with the prosecution that the crimes committed were intended to further the operations of a drug trafficking enterprise, threatening the security and best interests of the United States domestically. He further dismissed Velasco's claims of misjoinder and severance, stating that linking the trial to the activities of co-defendants in the Gutierrez trial was necessary to demonstrate the coordinated and connected cartel efforts against the DA, which satisfied the requirements of a joint case.
This case held some key implications for the future of a potentially broadened scope of extraterritoriality. The primary area of contention in the case centered around the subjective intention of Velasco to murder the American tourists under the false suspicion they were DEA agents. This case demonstrated that proving intention to commit an act against the U.S. could potentially be enough to prosecute extraterritorially, regardless of whether or not the actual crime satisfied the requirements. This case illuminated the importance of mens rea in the international sphere of law and will likely provide crucial precedent to future cases involving the intended attack against the nation abroad.